The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
And welcome in everyone to this edition of the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey. Glad to be here, third weekend into the month of January 2025. A big week for the country, JDoc, and a great guest here on the Labor and Energy Show to tell us what it all means. But as I said to you in the pre-show prep, I kind of feel as though everything we've been talking about since the Labor and Energy Show launched has all of a sudden become center stage for conversation in 2025.
Yeah, Joe, no question about it. And so the Labor and Energy Show we launched several years ago. Certainly, we represent organized labor and in our energy sector. And so our traditional energy industry is a big part of, what we talk about, okay? And certainly our workforce depends on those jobs. Our country depends on our energy security, okay, and which has been in jeopardy. And certainly the conversation and the narrative has been controlled over the last several years, by individuals who are not supporters of our jobs as well as our traditional energy industry. Okay, we all care about the environment, you know that. But like you said, Joe, we are on the cusp of a new era in traditional energy. And so we have so much to talk about. And today is going to be a great show. Robert Bryce is our guest. Can't think of a better guest to talk about these issues with. So lots to talk about.
Yeah, no doubt about that. A reminder for 2025 to listeners, viewers on YouTube, if you want to download a version of today's broadcast via podcast, go to Apple or Spotify and search the Labor and Energy Show. You may want to do that for this episode. This episode with Robert Bryce is going to be 44 minutes of just great conversation, and I'm sure Robert and JDoc will touch on liquid gold and the EV mandates and everything else that were all part of the change in Washington. So a lot coming up here on the Labor and Energy Show. We'll take a quick commercial break. JDoc and Robert Bryce on the other side. Back in a moment.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
If you own a company and you're not producing a podcast, you're missing out. The public consumes messaging when they're ready. Join the professional podcast network of companies and let Jacob Media Partners put you in the podcast arena. Come to our professional studio, or we'll come to your place of business and professionally produce your company podcast. Call Jacob Media right now at 267-261-3428. 267-261-3428.
Welcome back to the Labor and Energy Show here on the Jacob Media Network. I couldn't be happier to have Robert Bryce on the program. Robert, how are you, sir?
So good, JDoc. So good to be with you.
And you're hailing from Austin, Texas, and you mentioned you had some snow yesterday, huh?
That's right. We had snow, JDoc, and I didn't lose power. So I thought that, that things are trending the right direction, because 3 years ago we lost power for 48 hours in the center of Austin. We're not out in the boondocks. And so things are moving the right way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, my friend. I am sporting my Eagles green. As you know, we hail from Philly here, and we got some hurdles, but we got a big weekend. We've had you saw the game last week. You know that we had a ton of snow.
Yes.
So I mean, we'll see what happens. We're excited, but we're playing the Washington Commanders, and they got a good young quarterback. So fingers crossed. But I could do without the snow. Okay, it's not good for anybody.
I like watching it on TV. I like watching them thrash around in the snow, and I like being warm and watching it on television because I'm not there.
It's funny because, we watched it over a friend's house. By the time the game was over, it was a blizzard here. And I agree with you. It was cool watching Saquon Barkley, run the distance in the in that snowstorm, and it was, certainly cool. But we got another challenge this week, and taking nobody lightly. Anyway, having said that, my friend, ecstatic to have you on the program. I want a little introduction. I want Robert Bryce. This is I believe your third appearance on our broadcast. Based in Austin, Texas, an acclaimed author, 6 books, a journalist, a film producer. Okay, hosted the popular Power Hungry podcast, and a public speaker. Has been writing about energy, power, innovation, and politics for over 30 years. His articles have appeared in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Forbes, just to name a few. Is one of the nation's foremost energy experts, as well as a major proponent of nuclear energy and utilizing nuclear energy as a primary energy source and a key solution to lowering our carbon emissions. I'm ecstatic to have you on the broadcast, my friend. And like you said, a lot going on. There's a new administration in Washington, D.C. Okay. And, executive orders. I mean, there's been a slew of them over the last, obviously, couple days, coming right out of the gate on energy, issuing, a ton of other executive orders. But I'd like to have, can you give us a sense of your take on them generally? What are your thoughts, sure. Good, bad, the ugly? And if you will, your newsletter, which is fantastic, obviously mentioned the big reversal, which you talked about in
sure.
your newsletter yesterday, if you will.
Yeah, sure. Glad to do it, JDoc. Man, and it is the big reversal. And this is what I published on my Substack yesterday, robertbryce.substack.com. What we have seen since President Trump has taken office is the biggest turnaround in energy and climate policy in American history. And at the stroke of a pen, and it was just the stroke of a pen, Trump signed executive orders on getting out of the Paris Agreement, an executive order on wind energy, another one on called Unleashing American Energy, in which he has effectively reversed every one of Joe Biden's climate and energy policy. Now, everyone, I would say most all of them. It ended the EV mandates, ended the attack on gas-fired appliances. The list is long, JDoc, but it is a a remarkable change. And I say this as a reporter, not as a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. But what Trump has done here, I think, is a real embrace of energy realism, which is something that we've desperately needed. And I hope we can spend a bit of time talking about our new Secretary of Energy. I guess he hasn't been confirmed yet, but he's had a confirmation hearing at Senate Energy and Natural Resources. Chris Wright will be the new energy secretary. It's Trump's best pick of all the people he's appointed. I think it's the one that is to me the most important and the one that's most hopeful.
Well, by the way, Chris has been on the broadcast.
Oh, good.
Oh yeah, so we're obviously proud of that pick. Obviously, you talk about the executive orders in energy, and we have been led around by the nose by a left-wing ideology, and we're going to get into a lot of those things. Okay, but let's talk about your newsletter. Okay,
sure.
The big reversal. You talk about big wind. Okay, yeah. And the lack of accountability that they faced over the last several years, to say the least. Okay, and they're bullying our farmers, our rural areas. Talk about that particular instance that you did in your newsletter.
Sure. Well, finally, we have a president, a politician in high office who cares about wildlife. I mean, this is something that to me is just stunning, JDoc, and I'm a lifelong bird watcher, proudly so. I'm a longtime critic of the wind business, proudly so. And why is that? Well, because the impact that the wind industry is having on birds is undeniable. And the wind industry continually, they like to say, oh, well, cats kill birds too. That's fine. Cats are not killing golden eagles. They're not killing bald eagles. They're not killing some of our most iconic wildlife species. Further, this push for offshore wind has completely, it's just incredible to see these, climate NGOs. I don't call them environmental groups. They're not environmental groups. Just say, oh, it doesn't matter that we want to build all these wind projects in the middle of North Atlantic right whale habitat, a critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. So instead of, having environmental groups who really care about wildlife, what we've seen happen on the East Coast of the U.S. is these NGOs, Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, National Wildlife Federation, get in bed with big wind, and in doing so, deny the impact of wind energy, the development of wind turbines on the eastern seaboard, and deny that they're having any impact on whales. Imagine if instead of it was wind turbines, it was the oil and gas industry. They'd be going crazy. But in any case, I digress. But what we've seen now with this executive order on wind energy, it's a long title. It's called suspension of temporary moratorium on leasing and outer continental shelf lands and wind energy, or something like that. Trump is calling out and calls for all the agencies of the federal government to look at the impact of wind energy on wildlife, and it says including but not limited to birds and marine mammals. So finally, it's taken the re-election of Donald Trump to bring this issue to the forefront, and I can't tell you how happy it makes me, because I've seen whales in the wild. I saw some last summer in British Columbia. It's an incredible sight, and this appreciation and understanding of the need to conserve our most endangered species has been thrown aside in this climatism and push by big wind.
Well, I'm confused, Robert. I thought we were the bad guys. I say the hypocrisy is unbelievable. We just watched a big part of Los Angeles burn because of a fish. Okay. We certainly, there's no water there because they wanted to preserve a fish. Okay. And they're willing to sacrifice the whales. Okay. The birds. Okay. It's a little confusing when you talk about the narrative. Fairly convenient.
Yeah.
If you will, talk about the lack of accountability there.
Sure.
As the tables have turned.
Yeah. Well, the tables have turned. And what we are seeing now, as I said, is the biggest reversal on energy and climate policy in U.S. history. The the challenge, I think, just I'll jump ahead a little bit here, is the challenge is going to be for the, what can the Trump administration accomplish in the next 18 months, right? Because the midterms are already looming, right, in 2026. So it's imperative, I think, for the Trump crowd to do as much as they can in the next 18 months as possible. But they've already signaled what they're going to try to do. The challenge is going to be with regard to wind and solar. It's in Congress. What can they do about the subsidies, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit? Because as the U.S. Treasury Department reported just in November, the 10-year cost of the ITC and PTC will be something on the order of $420 billion. I mean, this is a raid on the Treasury in the name of climate change by big wind and big solar. So that's going to be a difficult lift for the Trump administration because of the entrenched interests that want to keep those subsidies flowing, and they are massive. Now, your question, and if I remember it correctly, you're saying, how is this? I'm going to rephrase it as best I can remember. This environmental betrayal. I mean, and I think that's what it is. That's the gist, I think, of what you're getting to. It's exactly that. It's a betrayal of the open space, a betrayal by these climate NGOs, which operate on budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. NRDC, $190 million a year is their annual budget. Sierra Club, I think it's $180 million. These are incredibly wealthy and powerful entities, but they've become climatists. They are not environmental groups. They are focused solely on climate change. And what do I think about climate change? Climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern. We have to balance whatever action we take on climate with all these other issues, including protection of wildlife, affordability, reliability, resilience of the system. We've been given this kind of either or scenario, or either or choice. It's not either or. We have to be very careful about what we're doing when we push decarbonization.
So you wrote an article, a newsletter. Big wind and big solar are trying to sue rural America in the submission.
Yeah.
If you will, sir.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I've been watching for years, JDoc, and proudly so. I spend a lot of time in rural America. I love farmers. I love ranchers. I love anybody who turns a wrench. And what do I hope to do in my career? For the people who don't have much power. They don't have much political power. They're the people who have their names on their shirts at work. I love those people. And what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years now, but particularly since the passage of the Inflation Wind and big solar companies suing small towns and in rural America to try to force them to take wind and solar projects they don't want. One example of this, Boone County, Illinois, which is about 100 miles, I think it's southwest of Chicago. They got sued by a company called Nexamp Solar, which is backed by a company called Generate Capital, which was founded by the outgoing loan program officer at the Department of Energy, Jigger Shaw. Now, Shaw doesn't have any connections with Generate now, but what we're seeing is these, big moneyed interests trying to build wind and solar in rural America on farmland, a lot of places where there's, very valuable ag land. And they're essentially trying to intimidate these small entities and these small governments into taking projects that the locals don't want. So it's very much a clash of urban versus rural. But I think these projects, there's nothing about climate change involved here. It's all about money. And so it's a very clearly big business, big law firms, big NGOs, and big banks against small town America.
Yeah. How many lawsuits are there? I think there's like over 100 lawsuits, right? In regards.
I think that number is high. I think I listed 8 or 9 in my article since 2022, and that is definitely an undercount. I've heard of other projects since then. But to me, it's just an example of how this, and of course, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, they don't write anything about this. This doesn't fit the narrative, so they don't write about it, right? They don't write about, the clean energy transition and all the rest of it doesn't fit their narrative of actually what is happening is this bare knuckle legal tactics by big business against rural America. And that doesn't fit their narrative, so they won't write about it.
So, yeah, I think what it was that the small towns have voted against these projects, something like over 100 times. But we had talked about a while ago a wind farm, okay, and
Yeah.
you're a major proponent on nuclear. So when you talk about these rural areas, I imagine because there's a lot of wide open space, they want to use
Yeah.
that for their wind turbines, which really sounds like a great thing. I mean, I'm being sarcastic for the environment and certainly, like you said, because these are not very politically influential areas. What is the comparison in regards to area?
Yeah.
Okay, that you need, what type of space do you need for a nuclear power plant in
Yeah.
comparison to an equally effective wind
Sure.
wind farm?
Excellent question, JDoc, because this goes to the heart of the whole thing. Look, I'm not a partisan when it comes to energy and power. What am I in favor of? I'm in favor of cheap, abundant, reliable, right? Because expensive energy is the enemy of the poor. So why do I care about it? Well, because I said I'm a humanist, but when it comes to the affordability, when it comes to the land use issue, this is key because to answer your question directly, wind energy requires roughly 2,000 times more land than a nuclear plant. A solar project requires about 200 times more land area than a nuclear plant. So why am I so pro-nuclear? Because I'm pro-nature. I want small footprints are the environmental ideal. We don't want to be covering all of rural Pennsylvania or rural Ohio or rural New York with wind turbines and solar panels. That is anti-environment. We want small footprints. Small footprints are the environmental ideal. And this is just simply a matter of simple physics that's called power density. And it's the rule of what I call the iron law of power density. The lower the power density, the higher the resource intensity. So if you have to put up 2,000 square miles or 2,000 acres of wind turbines to equal the power density of 1 acre of nuclear, it means more steel, more copper, more concrete, more all of these inputs that are required because of low power density. It's just about physics. It's not about political belief or want to. This is just basic math and basic physics.
It's funny because I'm thinking that you can't put the wind farms on top of trees. You'd have to cut the trees down in order to do that. And the farm area, is flat land, like you mentioned. Okay, so they're going to pick on the little guy. I'm so happy that you shed light on that because a lot of regular folks, who don't live in those rural areas are, I'm sure, not abreast of those situations.
Let me give you, if I could, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was in Christiana, Wisconsin. Now it's been almost 2 years ago. It was in April of 2023. And I have friends there. My friend John Barnes lives there and Roxy Ingolstadt and the town supervisor, Mark Cook. They took me around, they drove me around to show me what's happening. So Invenergy, which is a Chicago-based company controlled by a billionaire named Michael Polsky, the company is majority owned by a Canadian company. They want to pave as much as 7 square miles of the farmland around this little township of Christiana. This is some of the best ag land in all of Wisconsin, which means it's some of the best ag land in all of the world. And they want to cover it with solar panels, most of which undoubtedly are sourced in part or in whole from China, in order to let the utilities that are going to buy the solar put a green tinge on their energy production. I mean, it's just outrageous. It's just the wrong thing to do. And so what we are seeing across the country are groups like Farmland First in Wisconsin fighting to protect ag land. But this is happening not just in the U.S., it's happening all around the world where farmers are saying, no, this is the wrong way to go. Are you out of your mind?
Well, it's interesting because I realized that, solar farms and solar, it just disappears in 10 years. That's the beauty of it. It just disappears. It's not a danger to the environment. Being sarcastic again, anything, about solar panels, okay, the subsidies often don't, cover the costs, number one. And number two, what do you, in 20, 25 years after they're done, we got to do something with them, right? I mean, and so,
and this trash that you talk about, there was a good Harvard study that was published just about 2 or 3 years ago, pointed out that in the next 20 years or so, the amount of trash, these old solar panels, the volume of it will be equal to or greater than the amount of new solar panels that are being produced. Well, where does all that go? It has to go in the landfill. So I think I take your point here, JDoc, and it's critical to think about what is the long term here? What is the life cycle analysis of these forms of energy, including wind turbine blades. They're not being recycled, they're being landfilled. So, the bottom line is, and this doesn't matter whether you're organized labor, whether you're just, Joe on the street, we have to think about what the long-term goal is. And what is the long-term goal? Small footprints, cheap, abundant, reliable energy and power with minimal inputs so that we have minimal trash at the end. And to me, that's natural gas and nuclear. I've been saying the same thing for more than 15 years.
Yeah, we're in the first run here with these. That's why, people, it's amazing what some people will accept and denial. Okay, and when you talk about that with an environmentalist, they don't want to talk about it. Let's do this, Robert. Let's take a quick break. We're going to need 3 hours with Robert Bryce. We're going to have more from the Labor and Energy Show and our guest, Robert Bryce, in just a minute.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
If you own a company and you're not producing a podcast, you're missing out. The public consumes messaging when they're ready. Join the professional podcast network of companies and let Jacob Media Partners put you in the podcast arena. Come to our professional studio or we'll come to your place of business and professionally produce your company podcast. Call Jacob Media right now at 267-261-3428. 267-261-3428.
Welcome back to the Labor and Energy Show on the Jacob Media Network. Our guest is Robert Bryce, acclaimed author, journalist, and public speaker. We're having a fantastic conversation, everything energy. Robert, we're obviously talking about the new administration. Talk to us about the reversal and a pause on LNG export approvals. Lots of our listeners are obviously LNG supporters, and we're disappointed to see the previous administration pause the LNG export approvals. Is this reversal something that can happen quickly, or does an agency have to do rulemaking? What are the implications of this specific part of the president's energy executive order?
Well, it's an important executive order. And before I get to that, let me just make a couple of quick points about the importance of U.S. LNG exports. First, of course, it's a big issue for labor because there's a lot of labor required to build the LNG liquefaction plants. So these plants are massive investments, multiple billions of dollars, massive amounts of steel. You need welders, you need pipe fitters, you need electricians, you need a whole lot of skilled labor to build these projects. That's point one. Second, U.S. LNG now has become a critical part of Europe's energy security, particularly since since Russia invaded Ukraine. U.S. LNG is now the biggest source of LNG into the European market, the single biggest supplier, which is truly remarkable that natural gas, methane, CH4 from Texas, from the Permian Basin here in Texas, from Oklahoma, from Louisiana, from not so much, I guess some from Pennsylvania, is now a key strategic commodity in the European continent. And it's going to continue to be a strategic commodity because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the reality that European countries don't want to be tied to Russian gas in the future. So those are critical points. But despite those obvious truths, the Biden administration right about a year ago announced this pause. Oh, we're going to look at the climate impacts of LNG. They based it, claimed on a very deeply flawed study published by a professor out of Cornell named Robert Howarth. His study has since been debunked multiple times, but yet this was part of this kind of ideological decision making that dominated and ideologically biased or ideologically based policy that was really the what drove so much of energy policy during the Biden administration, and that includes everything from bans on gas stoves or gas-fired appliances, EV mandates, the greenhouse gas rule on power plants, you name it. I mean, it was the most anti-hydrocarbon administration in American history, and there's no second place.
How quickly do you think this
right. How quickly will the LNG ban be reversed? That was your question. I went off on a tear there. You got me all going all Joel Osteen on you here today.
That's what I lost you for a second there. Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Well, so the LNG pause, I think it's going to, it's going to take a few weeks or maybe a couple of months for the federal bureaucracy to work its way through these things, but it's definitely going to be over, and the U.S. will be permitting these export projects again.
So, there's been a lot of great policy and energy executive orders. One of the old adversaries to the refineries in our organization, did make an appearance in one of the executive orders, emphasizing it continues to be a bipartisan problem. The president directed the EPA to issue an emergency waiver, so E15 could be sold year-round. While we don't have a problem, obviously, with E15 specifically, the biofuel lobby has historically used its approval as a precursor to increase the ethanol mandate. So during the first Trump administration, the president issued small refinery exemptions, which brought the RFS cost for refiners down. But then he increased the RFS requirement for refiners that didn't get the exemption, which sent the RFS cost through the roof. And this hit a lot of independent refiners and contributed to the refinery closures once COVID hit. It was apparently all done to benefit Iowa, but came at the expense of states like PA and a lot of our union jobs. How can our listeners help persuade this administration that they don't need to keep mandating unachievable ethanol volumes, and need to keep the RFS costs in check to protect consumers and the refining jobs? We've had similar issues with congressional Republicans. They say they're free market, but all the Midwesterners love the ethanol mandate. Your thoughts?
Yeah. This is a tough one, JDoc, because the political power of Iowa is so big, looms so large in presidential politics. But you asked specifically how people in labor can help address this. I would say it's kind of tried to say, well, write to congressman, but that would be one thing. I think having a delegation of labor leaders meeting with top officials in Washington would be part of that as well. I mean, these are obvious things that you can do strategy wise. But maybe there's some hope. I'm just spitballing here because it's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it, given much thought to it. But, Trump is now a one-term president, right? He only has this term. So he's not going to run again. I mean, he's an old man already, right? Amazing. 78 that he got elected at all. I think Reagan was 73 when he was first elected. So right. Trump is done after this. So he doesn't have to play to the crowd in Iowa. So maybe by taking that off the table, and you also are not going to have an ag secretary from Iowa, which we've had for the last 8 years. Maybe we can see real reform here. I hope so, because I think the ethanol mandate and all of this is just, it's silliness, all of it.
Well, it did so much damage, especially like we said, when COVID hit. I also think there's so many people that still don't understand it. Okay. And so, we want to be proactive and certainly address the issue, talk about it now. Okay.
Right.
Let's talk about tariffs. We're going to spitball and we're going to, kind of riff a little bit.
Yeah.
But there's obviously a lot of talk about tariffs. We're all about tariffs to protect domestic manufacturers against foreign nations who cheat, namely China. Okay. Yeah. But in some cases, there are raw materials our manufacturers need to import. Okay. This is the main. This is the case with Canadian and Mexican crude. It's the type of crude many refiners were built to run on, which is heavier than shale crudes. Okay, yeah. East Coast refiners also don't have a way of getting shale crude from the center of the country to their plants because there's no pipelines.
Right.
So if you drive up, refiners and the energy manufacturers' crude costs, it could disadvantage them to import from refiners, which
Right.
is already flooding the East Coast. Do you think anybody on the Trump team understands this dynamic? Who knows how refining is different, from crude production, and where do you think it goes? This goes on these tariffs.
Yeah. Well, I would only be speculating, of course, JDoc here about what is going to happen with these tariffs, and particularly with regard to crude trade. But I am very hopeful. I think I mentioned earlier that we finally have a Secretary of Energy who knows the energy business. And remember that Chris Wright is the first energy executive to ever be appointed the Secretary of Energy. We've had Reagan appointed a dentist, JDoc. I mean, this is like, we've had lawyers, we've had technocrats, we've had academics, we've had all these people be the Secretary of Energy, and having actual experience in the energy sector has been disqualifying until now. But now we have Chris Wright, who I think is fantastic. I mean, he's an intellectual, he's an entrepreneur, he's an energy realist, an energy humanist. He's pro-nuclear, and he knows the energy sector backward and forward. And I'm very happy about the appointee for Deputy Secretary of Energy, James Danley, who was the FERC commissioner, knows the power grid as well as anyone in America. I think there are some really dynamic possibilities with those two in those jobs. And so I'm very hopeful that we will get rational policy.
Well, like I said, Chris Wright was on this broadcast, which I think was what put him over the top to get that nomination.
There's no doubt. The Labor and Energy Show, you and Krausey are the kingmakers. There's no doubt about it.
So there's obviously more good things in store for Robert Bryce.
Yeah. Look, I just want to be king. That's all. That's all.
So we've obviously spent a lot of time on EV mandates on this program, and how they're the future it is potentially devastating. Okay, it's a breath of fresh air to see the executive orders direct EPA to want to do those. But as I understand, that will take some rulemaking. How long could that take, Robert? And are there any roadblocks that would prevent a speedy action to undo the EV mandates?
Those are two good questions, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answers, JDoc. I think that what we're seeing already is by issuing these orders, Trump is creating uncertainty in that market. And that may be the thing that is capital hates uncertainty, right? The investors want to know what's going to happen with their money. Bankers, and, they want to know what the regulatory framework is going to be. But it is clear from these EOs that Trump is saying these mandates are done, and we want consumers to have vehicle choice. Now, I think you didn't ask this question, but I think one of the big wild cards here is to what extent the Trump administration is going to be able to eliminate the California's special status when it comes to rulemaking on electric vehicles, right? The EPA has effectively just ceded its authority to California. So, oh, well, because you're saying you want electric vehicles, go ahead. Well, I think that rule, or that accommodation for California, is very much in danger now. And it will likely have to be litigated. A lot of wild cards with regard to that. We haven't talked about Chevron deference and the Loper-Bright decision, but this is the other part of the story here, which is, what will happen in court, because so many of these things are now being litigated, including the greenhouse gas rule, that, the Trump administration will play a big role. So will the courts.
Drill, baby, drill. Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned, obviously Trump's agenda. By being on Trump's agenda, it's going to impact investors. It's going to impact the entire industries.
Sure.
Obviously, the Marcellus Shale is here in Pennsylvania. So many resources. How does that? And he's passionate about it when he says "drill, baby, drill." How does that impact the natural gas industry? And in regards to not only optimism, but future policy, keeping in mind that a lot of these are state, the state itself is going to have a big say in what happens.
Yeah, well, a couple of quick thoughts, JDoc. One is, the idea of drill, baby, drill. The U.S. is already drilling, and our production is both oil and gas is at or near record levels. I mean, it's just truly incredible.
Right.
And the other thing that's very obvious is that the drillers are doing more and more with less and less. we're maintaining these high levels of production with fewer and fewer drilling rigs. And that's a testament to the technology that's being applied in the upstream, right? Because the frackers and the drillers are so good at what they do. You know, a well that what used to take, 2 or 3 weeks to drill can be done in 3 or 4 or 5 days. So just incredible how much productivity they're wringing out of this machinery and these technologies. So I don't necessarily see, a big uptick in drilling, but as far as natural gas goes, I'm very bullish on the volumes. Now, will we see a big price run up in gas? Maybe, but remember, we're in the middle of a very cold bit of weather. And here, I'm just checking the spot price of natural gas today. I think this was yesterday. Oh, wait a minute. No, it's $3.81. It's less than $4. And the whole country, it's snowing in New Orleans, JDoc. And so we haven't seen a big run up in gas prices. And I think those prices are likely to be somewhat constrained because the drillers are so good at producing more. The problem in the Marcellus to address that is offtake capacity. They don't have enough pipeline capacity to move all that gas. And one thing I hope happens under Trump is that finally you can get a pipeline from the Marcellus into New England, and where they're having to burn a lot of oil because they don't for power generation because they don't have enough gas.
Absolutely. And, we're going to touch base on that in a couple of minutes. We only have about 8 minutes left. I want to run through this. I don't know if you saw yesterday, but Trump had a major announcement on the Stargate. He talked about he made his major announcement about a $500 billion investment in Stargate, the major AI initiative that will build data centers across the U.S., which will offer a major need for traditional energy resources to support the needs of the data centers. Talk about how that is going to impact traditional energy in the United States, because AI, is in many ways is a wild card to the environmental left. You can't support it with turbines and a lot of the renewable energy. What's your thought there in the future of AI as it relates to energy?
Sure. I just looked at those numbers on Stargate last night, and man alive, it's a massive project. And the power demands, I've forgotten how many megawatts or gigawatts that they're talking about. I think each campus was going to be 5 gigawatts, something like that. 5,000 megawatts. I'm just off the top of my head. But the punchline here to me is very clear, JDoc. It's all going to be fueled by natural gas. You can't do it with wind turbines and solar panels. Won't, batteries, no. It's not. These data centers need 24/7, 365 power. So this is very bullish for gas volumes. There's just no doubt about it, because that was already clear before this announcement. But all these new data centers of any size, they're going to be powered by gas-fired generation. A couple of quick points. EPRI, the electric, not EPRI, what, I'm sorry, I get my acronyms. There's about 7.5 gigawatts of data center capacity now under construction, right? We have a bunch of data centers being built now. Their aggregate demand is about 7.5 gigawatts. That's roughly how much new natural gas capacity is under construction. So it's very clear that for the next 5 to 10 years, all of this new demand from AI and for heat pumps, EVs, whatever it is, it's going to be met by gas, not by nuclear. There have been a lot of announcements, of course, from the big tech companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera. You're familiar with them. One of them, of course, is 3 Mile Island there in Pennsylvania. Those projects are years away from coming online. So gas is the story.
And you can't sub them out to overseas. They have to be in the United States.
Right.
So obviously, that's a huge deal. We only have a couple minutes, Robert, and I want to. Everybody's crying about America dropping out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, talk about that and your thoughts on that. And when you talk about that particular agreement, obviously this is the second time Trump is pulling out of it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, let's cut to brass tacks here. This was largely symbolism around kind of everyone genuflecting in the same direction about saying, oh, we're going to cut our emissions and thus and the rest of it. The reality is that the U.S. has cut its CO2 emissions on an absolute basis more than any other country in the world. and it's not even close. So Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord, I don't really think that's that big of a deal. But the reality is that, particularly given the massive increase in coal-fired generation that's being built in China and India, the reductions that are being made in the West are meaningless. And I'll say almost meaningless. So that's the reality. And so, of course, the NGOs all in with this point. The NGOs, the NRDC, we had climate mayors immediately after Trump pulls out of the Paris Accord saying, oh, well, we're going to fight this at the local and state level. And so that's where we're going to see a lot of focus now with Republicans in control of Congress and Trump in the White House. The climate activists are going to be working at the state and local levels to enact policies on climate that are going to be largely symbolic, but this is the game now. What the symbolism, the rhetoric, this is going to be flying fast and furious. But as we talked at the beginning, this is the biggest turnaround with Trump taking office. It's the biggest turnaround we've seen in energy and climate policy in American history. And I think most all of it is very positive for the consumer and for labor.
And having said that, okay, I'm going to end on this because, we certainly just are touching the tip of the iceberg. But you just touched on the fact that a lot of the fights are going to end up at the state level. Okay.
Yeah.
How important is it for supporters of traditional energy, okay, to keep advocating on behalf of our America's energy security and independence in the face of a radical left movement? Okay.
Yeah.
Because we have a new administration in there. Okay.
Yeah.
We have to keep in mind that the states still have much of the power, and the left-wing extremists still did plenty of damage when Trump, during Trump's previous term. Talk about that.
Sure. Well, I'll just add one quick point. And I said, I think the battle is going to be shipped to the courts, right? Because these NGOs are going to be suing on a lot of this policy. And the pro-energy, pro-humanists are also, there's a lot of litigation by industry to roll back other regulations that were passed during the Biden administration. So the courts are going to be a big area of the fight. But you're right. I think if, for people who are in organized labor, or even if they're not, people who are humanists, people who care about consumers, you need to be involved. You need to know the math and the physics. You need to advocate for cheap, abundant, reliable energy, because expensive energy is the enemy of the poor. And that's it, full stop. So engagement is important. And the more you're engaged, the more you're willing to speak up and be fearless, that's the key. We need more fearless advocates for cheap, abundant, reliable energy. We need more fearless advocates for energy humanism and energy realism.
Robert Bryce, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you being on the program, man. I'd love to tell Krausey to keep us rolling for another 20 minutes, because we didn't even get a chance to talk about nuclear and some of the projects that are going on across, and how the new administration is going to impact them. So we left some things on the table. We'll save that for next time. Thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
It's always a pleasure, JDoc. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much, Robert. We're going to have more from the Labor and Energy Show in just a minute.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag, and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third-generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
If you own a company and you're not producing a podcast, you're missing out. The public consumes messaging when they're ready. Join the professional podcast network of companies and let Jacob Media Partners put you in the podcast arena. Come to our professional studio, or we'll come to your place of business and professionally produce your company podcast. Call Jacob Media right now at 267-261-3428. 267-261-3428. And back here on the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey. Boy, JDoc, you hit the nail right square right in the middle of the head on that last statement. I would have loved to extend this Labor and Energy Show with you and Robert Bryce for, geez, another hour. You know, there's a part two that we'll be able to get to, I'm sure, as this thing rolls along and things start to unfold in front of us here in 2025.
No question, Robert's one of the most knowledgeable people. We love having him on the broadcast. Look, there's a new administration. This is the Labor and Energy Show, okay? And obviously, a lot of changes over the last, a lot of executive orders, okay? And it'd be great if we could have a meeting of the minds and everybody work together on common sense energy policy here, okay? Because that's what we really need. One thing Robert was talking about, okay, we talk about the Paris Climate Accord. Okay, when they're building coal plants in China, okay, at alarming rates, okay, it confuses me and I think a lot of Americans. What good are all the gains that we're making if that's going on? By the way, a member of the Accord. So so much to talk about, so much we left on the table, Joe. But excited, obviously in regards to the future of traditional energy and the environment. Robert, like you heard Robert say. He's passionate about the environment like we are. We need the common sense solutions. Okay, we got to make sure that those individuals in China and around the world who are saying one thing and doing another, are doing the same thing.
No doubt about it. That's going to do it for this great edition of the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey. And I don't say that often. I only say that because it was an excellent interview with JDoc and Robert. Good conversation. Go back and re-listen to the broadcast on Apple or Spotify. You can download the podcast, search the Labor and Energy Show, and you can consume this and all of the upcoming shows for 2025. On behalf of my partner, the host of the show, JDoc, I'm Joe Kraus. See you next time, everybody.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jane that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.